Welcome to the Talking Transformation Podcast's COVID Diaries. This is entry number 3, recorded on the 27th of March 2020, the first day of the national lockdown here in South Africa. We've said before that the Talking Transformation Podcast team remains committed to bringing you conversations from South Africa and beyond, and through this series of diary entries, we're speaking to colleagues, professionals around the country, around the globe, about their experiences and how their cities are dealing with the issue of COVID-19. Professor François Viruly heads up the University of Cape Town's Urban Real Estate Unit, or URERU for short, and you may have heard François in our FutureCast panel discussion recorded earlier this year. We're delighted he's back again today to consider, even at this early stage, the possible impacts of COVID-19 on the national economy and the property sector more directly. We try and find possibilities in a time of great uncertainty and think about the factors and opportunities that could shape future trends more directly post-COVID-19. We ask, what could land use look like in the months and the years to come when considering issues of residential, industrial, retail and office space? As always, the perspectives are thought-provoking and challenging and will be a useful reference for all of us looking at the formal and informal economy both now and in the future. As with all of our guests, we are indebted to François for the time and effort that he gave the podcast, and we wish him and his family all the very best in the future. To all of our listeners, continue to flatten the curve and inkosi sikelele iAfrika. So it's Friday afternoon. It's the first day of the shutdown here in South Africa. On the line via Skype, I have François Viruly across the city in Cape Town. François, how are you today? How are you keeping? How's the health of your family?
It's the first day here, and it's adjusting. I suppose the one thing we've had in South Africa is that, in a way, maybe we did see it coming. So the universities have already been closed close to, a week and a half, close to 2 weeks. So yes, I think there was a sense of it's not quite settling in, but you suddenly, as somebody who was interviewed some time ago, you start wondering what life was before the shutdown. But anyway, we're not there yet.
Quite right. I think, even from my side, we saw a sort of working from home arrangement already a week ago. So some of us have been sort of living within that framework for the last week or so. As you say, UCT closing down. What was the reaction there on campus when the sort of instruction to close down went out, François? What was the general sense between the staff there, the students?
A university is a community, it's not just a place of learning. We have responsibilities for each other. And you can well imagine when students who were in reses, international students stuck, not able to get home. So you're dealing with a lot of issues, and it's something which we can't talk about. And this is not just a medical issue. It's not just it's a pandemic, of course, but it's also the psychological impact that this has, as well as the social impacts are quite considerable. And I suppose the other thing is that we are dealing with, it's one thing to say, let's go online. It's something else to actually do it, to shift your courses suddenly to an online format is something very, very different. And some members of staff will cope with it easier than others.
It also, of course, works on the basis, François, that your students and academic staff have access to that digital platform. And, data, we know, is a big issue here in South Africa, access to things like 3G and so forth. So it is going to be quite a challenge, I think, for everybody to be in that space together. The whole question of equity in society, again, in South Africa, becomes quite a big thing, not just in spatial terms, but now also in terms of the data divide.
Exactly, the data divide. And I think a situation like this does bring out the social inequalities, disparities in society, and it brings it to the fore. We do have students, watching a lecture, you can blow an entire bundle that you've paid for, You're
Sure.
in a very different situation than being somewhere where you have unlimited data. So I think we have to be very cognizant of that. And as is often said, in the South African scenario, when you have a Gini coefficient to the scale that South Africa has, what policy can you really put in place that will serve broadly? Very different to in Europe, where you have a broad middle class that you're dealing with. And we need to take cognizance of that.
Well, I mean, Francois, you're a familiar voice to many, certainly many of our listeners. They would have heard you on the radio. You were kind enough to give us your insights and thoughts on a panel only a couple of months ago when we met at the CIFA House, working with the architects, planners, engineers and surveyor society, where we had a panel discussion about the future. What did we see in the future? And I'm thinking back to that. I haven't re-listened to it since I recorded and edited it. One thing I recall you saying was that after a very difficult 2019 and a period of, let's call it, recovery from the state capture of the last decade or so, that your reflection on what has gone in the last year or more has been the resilience of the economy to withstand it. And the other point that you made was, another period of, for example, state looting. It couldn't withstand that. What none of us talked about at that point was this idea, and keep in mind that at that stage, China would have been already in lockdown from the outbreak of the disease and the way it was being dealt with there. None of us on that panel talked about this period that we see. Nobody said we're going to be bunkered or hunkered down in our homes trying to beat an invisible enemy. So, I mean, this question, can the state's economy, and in its various guises, both the formal as well as the informal economies, is it going to be able to withstand this immense shock to the system? Today, it's to test that. It's to test your thinking at this very, very early stage. But let's talk about how you think that both the formal and informal economy will be able to cope. Will it prove resilient again on the backside of this? And what is it we should be watching for?
Interesting. Yeah, that was a great discussion that we had, a few months ago. I think, first of all, the big difference between this and the state capture that we faced was an attack on our institutions. And I think that was the enormous danger of what we there. And I suppose the word looting was the correct word. What we're dealing now, yes, it is a pandemic, but I don't see this in the same light as an attack on our institutions. If anything, it will show the resilience of our institutions. And I think we're starting to see some of that coming through at the moment. And I think that's probably the difference that we're seeing. If you're asking the question whether our economy can take this, the answer is no. We're scraping the barrel from a fiscal perspective at the moment. There is little leeway to go. Yes, we can put funds together and hope that will assist. But I think we're in a precarious situation with the economy. And I think that some companies won't get through this. I mean, we just have to see what happened yesterday, the announcement from Edcon. Yeah, for your international listeners, I mean, a big retailers, CNA, Jet, Edgar's, it probably won't make it through this.
These are your anchor store tenants and so forth in shopping centres, as an example, hey, Francois?
Absolutely. And we can talk about the impact on the sector. But I think there are some companies that have already been going through a tough time. And want us to remember that the cyclical downturn in South Africa started in December 2013. So we're 6 years of cyclical downturn. So we've got companies that are already in difficult positions. And this, on top of it, can put us in a very serious position. Now, how do we get out of this? Just from an economic perspective, Skidelsky, who wrote on the life of John Maynard Keynes and has put a number of books out on his economics, had a book that came out post 2008 called The Return of the Master. And I suppose what he was getting at was that the only way you're going to get through this is not through monetary policy. Interest rate declines really won't have much impact if there's no confidence. So I think all that you're left with is a macroeconomic policy. And the problem is that at the moment, we can't afford the fiscal stimulus that we would need. So really, all that we've got left from an economic perspective at the moment is very targeted interventions. So I think that this is where trade and industry probably has a bigger role than national treasury. in trying to get us. This is going to be to look after specific small companies that will become increasingly vulnerable, as well as helping out particular sectors. So this requires a very targeted intervention if we're going to get through this. So just to come back to your point, is this the same as what we've seen in previous years? I think it's different. And what scares me is that, yes, the economy is much more vulnerable than we've ever seen.
You make the point that we've seen sort of six years of flatlined growth. We're in a sort of technical recession. We know that both the residential sectors as well as the commercial sectors have been extremely badly hit. So, I mean, as you say, we're starting at vulnerable. It's a global thing. We're seeing it across the world, various stimulus packages which are being made available by the different governments, major investments from both the US as well as the UK governments as two examples. And the point that you're making is that the money's simply not there, that we're not going to be in a situation to do that. So targeting of sectors is what you've suggested. Which of these sectors do you think we'll have to target? Where would you start, Francois, if you were sat there in the Ministry of Trade and Industry of saying, what do we do? Where do we go? How do we start this conversation around trying to breathe life into something which is so badly affected by these different factors?
Well, I suppose the first thing I would argue is don't target companies that you knew we're going to go under. And really, I'll be frank, I think the SAA story has come to an end in this. To go and bail out an SAA further when you need that funding for companies that are good companies that need to be helped out in this environment. I think it's going to set the priorities as to where the spending is going to happen and who will be targeted. I think there are going to be two issues here. First, the labor market itself, which is going to become important. I mean, yesterday I was talking to a car guard, and what did he say to me? He said, if I don't die of corona, I will die from malnutrition. I think there are a lot, as far as the unemployment, the numbers of unemployed and those who will be underemployed for a while. So I think there'll be a lot of targeting in the labor market directly itself, and whether that will come through social grant, UIF, and others. So that will be the one issue. And then as specific companies, I think we could find ourselves with some retailers ending up in trouble. And I think that risk will rise as we go week by week. You know, some will get through it, and then you end up with your SMMEs and your base of small companies. Now, if you look at specific economic sectors, I think I'm not going to look at, I mean, I know there's been discussion about the agricultural sector and the impact that it would have here, but I think that the food sector will get through this. But I think and especially spatially, if we take the Cape Town scenario, tourism, of course, which plays such an important role in local economic development in the Western Cape, that will be one that will need specific attention. I think what will also be interesting to see is once we get through this, how do we get it going again? And some sectors will need assistance, marketing assistance to reposition themselves in the global economy.
What seems very clear is that the pandemic and the challenges, both in terms of the spatial as well as the economic, is not going to be an equitable experience. It's going to have differences. It's again revealing some of the inequalities in South Africa based on income, space, etc. It's very clear when you describe the car guard who is, saying if it's not one thing, it's the other that's going to hurt me, if not kill me. Yeah. And I mean, this is again where South Africa, I think I've been sort of watching with interest Brazil, India, those other areas with high density, high levels of poverty associated with major cities. What does this mean for the question of equity in our cities and urban areas, as well as on a global scale?
Look, I think what's going to be very clear is that different groups will experience the lockdown that we're seeing at the moment and the pandemic very differently. I think I've already been hearing during the course of the day that in the townships there are queues at the moment at supermarkets. Whilst if I hear what is happening in the suburbs, shops are just about empty. Which also then, it also means that, yes, on a lockdown, how far are you going to go? You know, it's one thing getting into your car, going to your shopping center. It's quite something different when the taxis are not operating and you have little choice but to walk down the street, find the food or the supermarket that you can find. So yes, that experience is going to be different. And it's also, of course, very different how you earn an income. You know, moving from your office into your home is one thing. Working, let's be honest, in a factory where you were doing a particular job to sitting at home, your ability to carry on is very, very different. So I think that experience and your ability to generate an income. And then even, and I'm not saying that the office workers are all going to have a great time, but and be able to carry on working. You know, it's one thing to sit in a room that you've converted into an office. It's something else to sit at a dining table with 3 young children around you, trying to function with the bands the broadband that you face. So yes, I think that experience is going to look. The biggest issue which we have to really look at in South Africa is whether it will lead to social strife or not. How long can you carry on? How patient will everybody be in the weeks to come?
I want to paint a scenario, Francois, and I want you to suggest to me whether I'm being naive and maybe Pollyanna-ish about it. But I see a particular outcome that is possible. If we look at what we've learned from around the globe and the responses of different countries, as well as different states and different cities, what we see is that South Africa has reacted fairly quickly in respect of the pandemic's spread. So we hopefully have shut this down before it becomes almost an apocalyptic scenario in terms of its spread and slowing this idea of flattening the curve. If South Africa is able to get through it in the coming weeks and coming months and respond and rebound quicker in terms of its health issues, notwithstanding the challenges we have with the health service, notwithstanding the challenges we have with the levels of TB, HIV, etc. Let's say we are able to come out of it on the one side quicker than most. Second, that we see a degree of leadership at least at the national level, which has been, I would argue, lacking for that decade that we talked about earlier, and that the leadership translates into a degree of optimism. Is there a scenario that's conceivable where actually South Africa is able to almost control, alt, delete, reboot the coming decade based on the principles of good governance? You've talked about there has to be done, some hard decisions around some of the institutions like South African Airways, etc. But really focuses our attention is based on sound leadership and business principles, more so than, let's call it, party politics and personality-driven cults with respect to certain of the political parties, and is based on getting us through it, not just for the next few months, but for the coming years. Is this something that I'm living in cloud cuckoo land, or is it a possibility which actually sees us in a position where we can kick on harder and better than some of the other economies which are really, really going to struggle because of the spread?
I've been thinking about this for myself, and I've really pondered on how, A, do we get out of this, and B, will it be a different world? As far as the options that we have, I think you're quite right. I mean, I think every country is just about finding its own way of handling the situation. The Netherlands as an example, they took a view which says no lockdown. Let's create a sort of herd of immunization. In other words, isolate the vulnerable and the old, but let the young out. And it's not party time, far from that, but let the world carry on, and hopefully a large group will be immunized in the process. I suppose we had two options. which everyone has. One, you go into mass testing, or secondly, you go into a lockdown. And I think in our scenario, the mass testing was just not an affordable option. I don't think that we could have gone down that route, which really only left us with the lockdown. I don't think that there were many options. And I think the lockdown is the only possible option that we could have dealt with, of course, its social, political, and economic implications. I think you could be right that we walk out of this with an understanding of what we can do. And the irony is when we are under pressure to achieve something, we actually do it in South Africa. And look, and it's certainly, I don't want to compare this to the World Cup, but when there was a requirement for transportation and many other things, we did it. And I think there's a good chance that we will do it. We will get to it. Whether this will stop the political bickering that we've seen, I'm less sure of that. I think that there's a good chance that in that respect, we move back maybe to normality, what we had. I think there'll be political discussions about maybe not compensation is a hard word, but who suffered most in these weeks. And yes, we will have that debate. And we could very well end up with a debate around inequalities and what the pandemic brought out.
If we look directly at land use and the property sector, and I'm going to break it down in very basics, like an industrial, a retail, a commercial, which is your office space and so forth, and residential. What do you think on the flip side of this we're going to see, François? The reason I ask is, we've started to see online shopping have an impact on retail. We've talked about work from home becoming a far more prevalent thing, even before the shutdown. I mean, it seems with congestion levels the way there are in our major cities, corporates are making decisions about flexible working hours. There's a whole range of things that are already going to impact on how cities look in 10, 20 years' time. This seems to be almost like a game. We use that word quite loosely, the game changers. But this one around game-changing moments of saying this is going to have a fundamental impact on how we understand space and land use, particularly in the formal market, particularly where you're seeing major growth of sectors which lead to sort of underpinned by sort of blue chip stocks and shares-based investments. So what are your thoughts around those? If we take each of them, let's take one at a time and a quick appraisal. Sure. Residential, commercial, retail, and industrial. What's your thoughts there, post-COVID-19?
Okay, so let's just talk about the residential sector first. If we talk about any property or the built environment, and the point I've tended to make is that no property is an island. Our built environment functions in a broad urban environment. The way that urban environment functions becomes critical. I think that we do have a situation where coming out of this, I don't see a major impact on the residential property sector. What I do see is the continuous trend that we're seeing in the sector. In other words, the densification. The important issue around densification is what happens in the urban environment. If you expect people to live in 20 square meters, you better give them a very good urban environment. And I think what we're seeing now will again bring up the enormous distances, disparities, the legacies of the apartheid city. I think those issues will come to the fore to what we're seeing at the moment, where we see societies not completely, of course, yes, with a lockdown, you don't see each other, but some will be locked in a very different part of town with a very different experience. The other thing is, and I certainly don't want to be flippant about it, but we've seen the numbers where the average South African spends about 30 up to 40% of their income on transport. Imagine if you could work closer to home. that you could save between 30 to 40% of your income from not traveling. It'll be interesting to see. There are a lot of people who will be working from home. And I don't want to say that people will end up with savings because of this, but you will be saving from your petrol cost over the next 21 days. You will be saving. Now, but really the point I'm making here is that it shows that we could function, or at least attempt to function in an environment that requires less traveling. And I think in that respect, it will be interesting to see what the next month gives us. Again, I don't want to belittle those who are going to have to operate in a very difficult environment. But it will show the importance of transport, and those who don't have transport in our cities, what it means for them.
Let's take retail as the next sector. François, any thoughts there about the retail sector, which has been taking quite a pounding in the last few years?
First of pounding, but I think the other thing this again shows, and again, certainly in the suburbs, is the dominance of shopping centers in our retailing experience. If you compare this to the shutdown of cities in Europe and the retailing, here it's about the shopping centers. It's about the closing down of a whole number of stores in a very specific locality. If we look at the shopping centers, yes, it will have an impact. I'm getting the first reports out of Europe at the moment where retailers who have been shut down have only seen about 25% of their rental income coming through. In other words, the rest are not paying or will be paying late or
unable to pay.
Or unable to pay. So I think we will see property companies, the owners of shopping centers, taking a hit on this. You must remember that even if you keep one supermarket open, you pretty much have to keep the entire shopping center going, sure. Even if all the other stores are closed, you can't drop people into a supermarket without everything else. So you got to keep all of that going.
And that's a costly infrastructure, right?
You've got to run that infrastructure. You still need the managers in place. You still need the security in place. You still need you still need to keep the shopping center going with two supermarkets running in it. Look, I suppose the other thing is, and I think where you're quite right, is e-retailing may well come to the fore, but of course you've got to assume, especially in this environment, that it can be delivered to you. What I'm also hearing internationally is that we're seeing our e-retailers being completely overwhelmed. Where did I read this morning that there was an e-retailer who had a queue of 10,000 people of orders that they had still to deliver. So it also shows the strain. But I think what it does start showing us as well, the one sector that will probably walk out of the situation the best is probably your logistics and warehousing. Because the logistics do have to carry on, you do have to warehouse. Now, of course, none of this is short-term. I mean, these are long-term trends that we're picking up in any case. I think what's going to be very important is how the retailers in the townships, small town South Africa, are going to deal with this. And there the problem, again, is you have to get yourself to these shopping centers. Drive to any small town and you see that people have traveled distances to get to that. And if that becomes problematic, then all sorts of other problems arise out of that.
François, just in terms of the informal retail sector, obviously many of our communities and traders are dependent on the footfall from, for example, taxi ranks, from major centres where there's a high turnover of people. So the trading spaces and that whole informal trade clearly going to taking a massive knock. Stock will be perishing. The ability of them to reset themselves once there's a degree of normality and the taxi ranks and these areas with high footfall reopen. What does this mean for the informal sector, particularly in the informal trading? Any thoughts on that?
Look, I think many years ago, the point, I can't remember who exactly, I think it was Amartya Sen, actually, who made the point that famines and lack of food is a social creation. There is food, but in many places where there have been famines, there was food, but just food in the wrong place. And I think that where our challenge is going to be is that we could find supermarkets in certain parts of town very well stocked, whilst a lack of stock in certain places where people just can't get food. So what I'm saying is that our ability to get the logistics right, and I think that's where your spaza shops and your small stores play a role, that we don't find ourselves in a scenario where there's plenty of food in certain parts, whilst others can't actually get to the food. And yes, and I think that distribution and the role of spaza shops and smaller retailers are going to play a very important role. Those are the neighborhood stores, the stores that you can get to, where you don't need to get to the other part of town. And for a lot of people, and I think you're quite right at taxi ranks, a lot of retailing happens on the way to work, coming back, and that becomes problematic.
François, we saw the industrial sector taking particular hits because of the load shedding. I mean, it's almost a word that we've forgotten about given the recent crisis. The load shedding was a major impact on our economy, almost the investment psyche of the country. We were assured that during this period of the next 3 weeks, that load shedding will be off the table. Let's hope that is the case.
Well.
But let's watch this space. But the whole industrial sector, and I mean, what does it mean on the return to whatever normal looks like? With the industrial, as soon as the factories and so forth boot up, clearly energy becomes a challenge. We know we've been in a challenging environment because of the capacity and the lack of capacity in the system at the moment. This seems to me to be probably the most vulnerable of all, but perhaps, I mean, this is not there's an expert, but this is an observation of the challenges for the industrialists in the country right now.
I think it comes back to the point that I touched on earlier, and I suppose the point is really that industrial South Africa has already seen the effect of poor economic growth. A lot of industrialists, like I said, since 2013 have had to deal with this. And so for a lot of them, this was really the hope that we would slowly be getting out of our recession. Now, in this environment, it would be very difficult to forecast an economy that's going to move out in a recession in the next year. I think that this will take time to rebuild. And look, I mean, I don't want to exaggerate it as well, in the sense that the forecasts which we're starting to see out of China, Europe is arguing that maybe by May, June, they could be out of it. So yes, you're off by a quarter of the year. I think that's the way that you have to see. This is not years after years, but yes, you've lost a quarter of the economy pretty much. Of course, the retail sector and others can carry on. So, but I think the point nevertheless remains that the balance sheet of many South African companies are weak at the moment. The loan to values are high for many companies. And it will really, like I said, it will be the weak companies may well not get out of this. And that's equally true for the industrial companies. And you must remember the exporters will have to wait a while before the global economy starts picking up. And one of the problems that we have had in South Africa is that we were trying at least to get out of the cyclical downturn in a period when the global economy was starting to slow in any case. So if you end up with a recession, and it's sounding fairly likely in Europe and in North America, I think it could have still dire consequences. So I think your point is also an important one, and I think it's one that we've chatted about and just now. And it's not only the months that we're going to be in it, but it's also going to be the months it's going to take to get everything going again and to get this economy moving. And you must remember, it was an economy that had shifted into a recession last quarter. The cyclical downturn has been a little longer, but we were already moving into negative figures. So yes, it's quite different if you're the United States or China or India, where you were growing at 7% per annum entering this. We're entering this with negative economic growth largely.
It certainly doesn't feel good nor pretty. And I mean, here we are, you and I talking from home, everyone hunkered down in their own home bases, the infrastructure trying to work from home. I get a sense that government isn't going to look the same way. I get the sense that corporate South Africa isn't going to look the same after this. It's almost like a test run for a direct challenge to the office world as we've known it, of how is it going to look where people or companies are spending quite high amounts of monthly income into their leases and the rental of properties. Yeah. And what do you think in the commercial office sector we'll see on the backside of this in terms of that commercial sector, the office space in particular? We talk of P grade, premium, A, B, and C categories. I see this is going to be particularly challenging as well.
It's an issue. You believe in WeWorks or you don't, but I think that co-working is with us. And co-living, co-working are trends that are critical. I mean, again, I saw the survey of the Urban Land Institute. The first 5 sectors that investors are looking at are logistics, and then the next 5 are actually residential. And I think what's most important in all of those is that in the built environment, certainly in the property sector, it's no longer about renting out GLA, square meters. It's about a service. Property companies are going to look more and more like hotel groups. It's going to be about service. It's going to be about being able to work around town. And I think that in particular in countries like ourselves, where public transport is difficult for many people. I'm not saying that we don't. I mean, the private sector and the taxis play a role, but it is difficult. That if we can get people to reduce their movements through new working environments, where yes, you do have the WeWorks closer to lower income areas. And I think by doing that well, you can actually put money in people's pockets. It comes back to that point, spending 30% of your income on transport. And so, yes, our temptation is to say, no, of course, transportation systems are with us, and we try to improve them. But I think the ability of reducing the need for movement is important. And I think it does bring us into the world of smart cities, digital cities. Access to the city becomes more and more a digital access to the city, rather than being able to find your way to the metro offices. How do you interact through society? How do you interact through schools? But then once again, the moment you start putting people in homes or close to homes and make them work in smaller spaces, you have to have a good urban environment. I must be able to say, okay, I'm working from home, but let me walk out and get to the park close by, go and shop close by. And I think that interaction becomes more and more important as we start bringing that overused concept of home, work and play together. That actually has to work a lot better. You can't just say people go and work at home, but if you walk out of your home, well, there's not much that's going to happen. You'll be isolated in your suburb as well as your home. And I think that, yes, those concepts are fine, but I think it does put pressure in the delivery of a quality urban environment.
In summary, we knew we were in for a rough ride. You're suggesting that the logistics sector is maybe one of the few that is able to ride this out, that the coming off the back of an already a very difficult space, basically a technical recession that we're in, as well as the ability to face issues like the load shedding and so forth, it makes it a very difficult space even on the backside of this. Once the pandemic and the health issues are addressed, we're in for quite a rocky ride. And that from a state point of view, mass bailouts that we're seeing, like in a US or UK based approach, we just don't have that money. We don't have that quantum. Is that a fair summary of sort of 3 or 4 major points that of the conversation?
Absolutely. Yes, the medical crisis that we're dealing is of course the critical, but especially in countries like ours, emerging countries, the social, economic, and political effects of this could be a lot more dire than what we are seeing in more industrialized countries in Europe and North America. And I suppose the final issue maybe that we often don't talk about, and that is the psychological impact of all of this. And I think that the social psychology attached to what we're seeing, whether it's lockdowns, how society operates. And again, it touches on the point that we've made, how individuals and groups are going to experience this will be very different. So I think that sort of psychological and sociological impact that this could have is something that will need to be managed with the same importance as the medical issues that we need to deal with.
I think you make a very important point there, François, and it's clear that's one of the aspects we're going to have to look at in the coming days, coming weeks, is around the psychological aspects of this. This is going to be an issue that we are going to need as a country to deal with. Mechanisms to cope, mechanisms to not feel isolated and alone. These are things that we and hopefully these conversations that we're having are a small way of trying to contribute to the conversation. And I really want to thank you today, François, for taking time out. I was going to say from your busy schedule, I'm sure you are still busy, François, but thank you for spending the last hour or so with us and taking the time and effort. And, when we posted the first of our COVID diaries and spoke to Herman up in Nairobi and Carly in Bucharest, you were very quick off the mark to say, Peter, I'm keen. Let's talk about the issue and specifically some of these things on the economy and the economic impacts. We don't hold you to any of it, François, because we're asking you to crystal ball here. And just to share some of the thinking and get us thinking during this period of 3 weeks of thinking time. What when we go back, what is it that the lessons we can learn and take? That's exactly what we're after doing here today. So thank you for sharing. All the very best to you and your family. Please be safe and look after yourself.
If I can just say something, thank you very much for these programs. I'm a vivid listener to these, and I think for anyone who's interested in whether it's the urban environment, I think this is important listening to. I certainly ensure that my students are and will be listening to these programs. So it's a really service to society. So thank you very much.
François, have a lovely weekend and thank you for those kind words at the end. Look after yourself.
Okay, bye.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Talking Transformation podcast. Please engage with us and let us know your thoughts on this episode. You can do so via the Anchor podcast platform. There's a voice message function available via the app. You can also follow us on Twitter via Talking Transfo and the number 1. So Talking Transfo 1. Our theme music is kindly made available by Tribal Need. Find out about the music, the street art shows here in Cape Town and Europe via tribalneed.com.